Tony and Rachel sat in the parlor, laughing at a movie when the door suddenly burst open. Elizabeth stormed in, her face filled with anger. Tony jumped to his feet. "What are you doing here?" Elizabeth smirked. "What kind of question is that? You got me pregnant, wanted me to abort it? Never. I'm here. You're full housewife now." Rachel's eyes widened. "Tony? Who is she?" Tony stammered. She... But the words stuck. Rachel's voice shook. "Tony, I hope it's not what I'm thinking. Answer me." Elizabeth folded her arms. "Oh, it is. I'm pregnant. For your husband?" Tony's throat went dry. He staggered back, his lips trembling. Elizabeth stepped forward, arms crossed, eyes burning with defiance. "Yes, Rachel. It's exactly what you think. I'm pregnant. For your husband." Rachel's breath hitched. Her fingers twitched as she turned to Tony. "Tell me she's lying." Rachel's eyes burned with fury. She stepped forward, pointing at Elizabeth. "Get out of my house, now, or I swear you'll regret ever stepping in here." Elizabeth smirked, standing her ground. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now." Rachel lunged, but Tony quickly moved between them, raising his hands. "Rachel, please," he pleaded, his voice shaky. Rachel's chest heaved. "Tony, move! Let me teach this shameless woman a lesson." Elizabeth chuckled. "Try me, Rachel. I'm carrying your husband's child. Touch me, and you'll regret it." Rachel clenched her fists, her whole body trembling. Rachel, blinded by rage, stretched out her hands and shoved Elizabeth hard. Elizabeth stumbled, her eyes widening in shock before crashing to the floor. Her body went still. Rachel stepped back, her breath hitching. I didn't mean to." Tony's heart pounded. "Elizabeth!" He rushed to her, shaking her. "Elizabeth, wake up!" But she wasn't moving. His hands trembled as he felt for a pulse. Nothing. Panic seized him. "No, no, no!" He scooped her into his arms and bolted for the door. "Rachel, you've killed her!" he shouted, racing toward his car. Tony sped to the hospital, his heart racing. Doctors rushed Elizabeth inside, placing her on a bed for treatment. He stood beside her, hands trembling, whispering, "Please, don't die on me." A few hours later, Tony's phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. His hands trembled as he answered. "Hello?" he said cautiously. A deep, familiar voice came through. "Tony, what happened to my daughter?" Tony's breath hitched. Mr. George," his voice shook. She's not feeling fine, but she's in the hospital receiving treatment." Silence. Then, a cold, threatening voice. "If anything happens to my daughter, Tony, your life is in danger." Before Tony could respond, the line went dead. He stood frozen, phone in hand, completely speechless. Hours passed. Then, Elizabeth's eyes slowly fluttered open. Tony exhaled in relief, watching as the doctor checked her vitals. After a moment, the doctor turned to him. "Mr. Tony, she's stable now. Go get some provisions for her recovery." Tony nodded and quickly stepped out. As soon as Tony stepped out, Elizabeth grabbed her phone with shaky hands and dialed a number. "Hello, Daniel," she whispered. "I don't think this trap is going to work. His wife is too tough." Daniel's voice came through, tense. "Hope she didn't hurt you or the baby?" Elizabeth sighed. "She pushed me, but I'm fine. Tony rushed me here immediately." Daniel exhaled. "Be careful, Elizabeth. We need that baby to secure everything." Elizabeth bit her lip, glancing at the door. "I know, but Rachel won't make this easy." Daniel's voice remained calm. "Don't worry. After you recover, we'll set up a new plan." Elizabeth nodded, gripping the phone tightly. The call ended. She exhaled deeply, staring at the ceiling. The game wasn't over yet. Tony walked in, gently holding Elizabeth's hand as she took slow steps beside him. Rachel's eyes darkened the moment she saw them. She shot up from the couch, her voice sharp. "Tony, why did you bring her back here? Doesn't she have parents?" She took a step closer, her hands trembling with anger. "Do you want me to commit murder? Take her out of this house?" Tony sighed, his grip on Elizabeth tightening. "Rachel, please. She's just recovering from the wound you caused her. Let her stay and heal. It's only for a while." Rachel's jaw clenched, her breathing heavy. Tony took a deep breath and turned to Rachel. "This is my house. I do what I want." Without another word, he led Elizabeth to a room to rest. Rachel stood frozen, her fists clenched, fury burned in her eyes. Tony had brought another woman into her home. A few days later, Elizabeth felt strong enough to leave. Waiting until Tony was out, she grabbed her bag and slipped out of the mansion. Dressed elegantly, she walked away without hesitation, her mind set on meeting Daniel. As Elizabeth arrived at Daniel's house, he pulled her into a warm hug. "Hope you didn't get hurt the other day?" he asked, scanning her face. Elizabeth smirked. "I'm fine." Daniel leaned back, eyes filled with curiosity. "So, what's our next plan?" Elizabeth crossed her arms, a sly smile forming. "Since Tony has accepted me as family, it's time to drain his money and wealth." Daniel chuckled, nodding. "Now you're thinking smart." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed with determination. "He won't even see it coming." Elizabeth and Daniel sat together, plotting their next move. They knew Rachel was the biggest obstacle in their plan. If Elizabeth was to stay in Tony's house until she gave birth, Rachel had to be silenced. They discussed different ways to keep her distracted, something that would make Tony lose trust in her or force her to back off. Every detail had to be perfect. Elizabeth smirked, confident in their scheme. Daniel nodded in agreement. They were ready to execute their plan, ensuring Rachel wouldn't interfere until they had taken everything they wanted. Tony sat in his office, his head buried in his hands. His mind was in chaos. Everything was happening too fast. Elizabeth's sudden presence in his life felt like a trap. They had only been together for a few months, and now she was pregnant. But something felt off. He couldn't even recall how it all happened so quickly. His memory of their encounters was hazy. Had they really been together enough for this? Or was Elizabeth playing tricks on him? Doubt gnawed at him. Rachel's reaction, Elizabeth's boldness, none of it made sense. He exhaled sharply, gripping his chair. Something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. Tony returned home, exhausted and lost in thought. He sat quietly in the parlor, pretending to watch TV, but his mind was elsewhere. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house. He frowned and stood up to open the door. As he pulled it open, his breath caught. Standing before him was Mr. George, his face stern, flanked by two towering bouncers. Tony's heart pounded. Shock washed over him. What was Elizabeth's father doing here now? Mr. George took a step forward, his eyes burning with rage. "So, Tony, you allowed your wife to beat my daughter, the same daughter you impregnated?" His voice was deep and threatening. "And now you want to end her life by forcing her into an abortion, right?" Tony's throat went dry. He quickly shook his head. "Sir, it's not what you think. Before he could finish, Mr. George raised his hand, cutting him off. "I don't need your excuses." He turned to the two massive bouncers beside him. "Teach him a lesson." Tony's eyes widened. "Wait!" But it was too late. The bouncers lunged at him, their fists clenched. Tony barely had time to react before the first punch landed, sending him stumbling backward. Pain shot through his ribs as another blow followed. He gasped, realizing this was just the beginning. Rachel rushed into the room, her eyes wide with panic. Please, leave my husband alone, she shouted, stepping between Tony and the guards. Mr. George turned his furious gaze on her. So, you're the one who beat my daughter? Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, one of the guards raised his hand to strike her. Stop, Mr. George ordered, his voice firm. The guard froze. It's not her fault, he scoffed, glaring at Tony. If not for this stupid idiot, none of this would have happened. After the bouncers had beaten Tony mercilessly, they finally left with Mr. George. Not long after, Elizabeth stepped in. Her eyes widened as she saw Tony sitting weakly on the floor, his face bruised, while Rachel stood beside him, holding her waist. Elizabeth frowned. What happened to Tony? Rachel shot her a glare. Your wicked father came here and had him beaten up. Elizabeth's expression darkened. Don't you dare call my father wicked, she snapped. You and your husband brought this upon yourselves. You should face the consequences. Elizabeth and Rachel locked eyes, both burning with anger, ready to explode into a heated argument. But Tony groaned in pain, struggling to sit up, his body weak from the beating. His condition forced them to hold back their quarrel. Rachel clenched her fists, swallowing her anger. Elizabeth scoffed, shaking her head in frustration. The tension lingered, but for now, they had no choice but to set their fight aside. Silence filled the room as Tony remained on the floor, defeated. Months passed, and Elizabeth's pregnancy began to show. With her growing belly came a growing sense of entitlement. She acted like the boss in the house, making demands without hesitation. One evening, she and Tony sat in their room when she lazily stretched. Tony, go get me some water, she ordered. Tony sighed but stood up and left for the kitchen. Just as he was about to pour the water, Elizabeth called out. Your phone is ringing. Tony paused, setting the water down. He hurried back to the room to check his phone. Meanwhile, Rachel, who had been watching from the shadows, saw her chance. She tiptoed to the kitchen, pulled out a small bottle, and poured poison into the water. She smirked. Finally, I'm ending this nightmare, she whispered, before sneaking back to her room. Unaware of what had happened, Tony returned to the kitchen, picked up the glass, and walked back to Elizabeth. As he reached the parlor, just before handing it to her, the glass slipped from his fingers and shattered into pieces. Elizabeth gasped. Tony, what happened? Tony frowned, staring at the broken glass. Something felt off. Rachel watched from the hallway, her eyes widening in shock as the glass cup slipped from Tony's hands and shattered on the floor. She clenched her fists, biting her lip in frustration. How could this happen? She muttered under her breath. I won't give up that easily, she whispered, already thinking of her next move. Years passed, and Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy named Jerry. To avoid Rachel's constant troubles, Tony rented a new apartment for Elizabeth and their son, hoping for peace. Rachel, however, remained bitter. She had not been able to conceive, and the sight of Tony caring for another woman's child filled her with resentment. Rachel, blinded by jealousy and rage, sought out a group of dangerous men to carry out her darkest plan. She wanted Jerry, Elizabeth's son, gone. She met with them in secret, explaining what needed to be done. The plan was simple: attack Jerry on his way to school and ensure he never returned home. The men listened carefully and, after some negotiation, agreed to the job. They assured her it would be done without suspicion. Rachel left the meeting with a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing that soon Elizabeth would feel the same pain she had endured for years. One morning, Jerry stepped out of the house, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby. A black car sat parked just across the street, its windows tinted, hiding the figures inside. As he took a few steps forward, the car door swung open. a man in a black face mask jumped out, moving swiftly. Before Jerry could react, a gunshot rang out. The bullet struck him, and he collapsed to the ground. The masked man didn't hesitate. He sprinted back into the car, and within seconds, they sped off, disappearing down the road. Inside the house, Elizabeth froze at the sound of the gunshot. Panic surged through her as she rushed outside. Her heart stopped at the sight before her. Jerry lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Elizabeth let out a piercing scream as she dropped to her knees, lifting Jerry into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she shook him gently, calling his name over and over. Without wasting a second, she carried him to the car and sped to the hospital, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Upon arrival, doctors quickly took Jerry in for emergency treatment. Elizabeth paced outside the room, her heart pounding, fearing the worst. Hours passed, but finally, the doctor emerged with news. Jerry had survived. The bullet had missed any vital organs, and with time he would recover. He informed Elizabeth that Jerry had lost a lot of blood and needed an urgent transfusion. Without it, his condition could worsen. Elizabeth's hands shook as she absorbed the news. Without wasting time, she grabbed her phone and dialed Tony's number. As soon as he picked up, her voice broke. "Tony, something terrible has happened." She quickly explained everything: the shooting, the rush to the hospital, and the doctor's urgent request for blood. Tony was silent for a moment. Then his voice came through, filled with shock and urgency. "I'm on my way." Tony rushed into the hospital, breathless and anxious. Without hesitation, he approached the doctor, ready to donate blood for Jerry. The medical team quickly took his sample for testing. Minutes later, the doctor returned with a puzzled expression. "The blood types don't match," he said. Tony froze, confusion washing over him. "That's impossible," he muttered. His mind raced. If Jerry was truly his son, their blood should be compatible. A deep sense of unease settled over him as he stared at the unconscious boy, questions flooding his thoughts. Tony turned to Elizabeth, his eyes burning with anger. "Who is the father of Jerry?" he demanded. Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, the hospital doors swung open. Mr. George strode in, his face filled with worry. "What happened to my grandson?" he asked urgently. Tony let out a bitter laugh. "Your grandson?" He shook his head. "Ask your daughter who the real father of Jerry is, because it's not me." Mr. George's eyes widened as he turned to Elizabeth, demanding answers. Elizabeth broke down in tears. "It's Daniel," she confessed, her voice trembling. She clutched Tony's hands, pleading, "Please forgive me. I never meant to hurt you." Mr. George's face darkened with fury. "You've disgraced this family," he roared. Before anyone could say more, the doctor returned, his expression grim. "I'm sorry," he said. "We lost him. The blood loss was too severe." Silence fell over the room. Elizabeth collapsed to the floor, wailing. Tony's legs felt weak. Mr. George clenched his fists, his anger replaced with sorrow. The truth had come too late. Tony looked down at Elizabeth, his face filled with disgust and disappointment. "You see what you've done to yourself?" he said coldly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his heart heavy but firm in his decision. Elizabeth wailed, clinging to her father's legs. "Daddy, please forgive me," she sobbed. Mr. George sighed deeply, his anger fading into sorrow. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Elizabeth, I warned you about lies and deception. Look where it has led you." Days later, Jerry was laid to rest. The pain was unbearable for Elizabeth, knowing her selfish choices had cost her the life of her own son. Daniel, upon hearing the news, vanished without a trace, abandoning her completely. Meanwhile, Tony moved on, learning to rebuild his life. Rachel, despite her bitterness, reflected on her own wrongdoings. The tragedy had left wounds, but it also served as a lesson. Lies and betrayal only bring destruction. Honesty and integrity are the foundation of a peaceful life. Lies may bring temporary gain, but in the end, they lead to pain and regret. Always choose truth over deceit, for what is hidden will eventually come to light. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more thrilling stories. Like, share, and subscribe for the next adventure. Check our other stores of Housewife who abandoned her husband over a rich man.